Hello, welcome back to another sewing video. So today's video is a costume for my niece. I am making View E, which is the Belle costume from Beauty and the Beast. I am making a size 3. I want to be sure this costume comes out beautiful, but I also want to keep it cost effective. It wouldn't make sense to spend so much money on fabric when I know it's only going to be a one-time use. So I did take some shortcut. I went for the most cost-effective fabrics that were as close to the recommendations. So instead of tulle, I use voile, a sheer gold voile. For the bodice, I am using this cotton satin that was on sale. I'm using organza. And of course, interfacing, I don't have it near me right now, but it's there. I have the ribbon here, the 1.5 inch ribbon. To find the gimp, it was very difficult, so I ended up having to resort to this that I had purchased a while ago, and I'm going to try to make it work. So here's a little trick that I'm pretty sure a lot of people use. I don't want to ruin my pattern. What I've been doing is that I tuck in whatever size I don't need and use only the measurements for the size that I need. So in this case, a size 3, and then I fold it over what I don't need, and it's out of the way, out of the view. So now I got the perfect measurement for size 3. So pattern piece 8, 9, 1, 11, 23, and 2 are going to be cut with this fabric. Here's pattern piece 2. Here's 9. There's 23. Here's 11. Once I cut one, I'll place it here again and cut another one because you need 2 of these. And you also need 2 of these. Transfer it over all the markings. And the dots, of course. I made sure the markings I transferred over to both sides. So make sure you do that to all your pattern pieces. I also marked the number of the pattern piece to the back of the fabric, the wrong side, so that it'll be easier. I know that looks a little weird, but it's so that I won't confuse the pieces. Now I'm gonna move on to the next set of fabric, which is organza. Okay, so moving on to the next fabric. This is the organza. The pattern here says to cut in double thickness, which is not the same thing as cutting on a fold. I just learned that with this pattern. So the way you do it is you lay out your fabric selvage on the top and on the bottom. And then you grab the sides and fold it to the right, so that once the fabric is folded, you have selvage on the top and on the bottom. I hope that makes sense. It was a little confusing to me. I had to do a little Google search. Here's the fabric laid out. Here's the selvage at the top and also at the bottom. The fold, of course, and over there is the cutting ends. So for this part of cutting the patterns, the cutting ends are where the selvage would normally be. And then just lay out the patterns as you would normally. And now I am moving on to cutting the tulle. Okay, so I laid down pattern piece 10 on the tulle, and I'm cutting on the folds, and I'm repeating this step, repeating it 4 times, and then I am repeating it 3 times. 4 is for the overskirt, and then 3 will be for the peplum front and back. So total you'll have 7 number 10s cut on the fold. Step 1 is to stay stitch the bodice front 1 and bodice back neck edges from cut edge in the direction of the arrows. So I have my pattern pieces here. This is pattern piece number 2, and as you see, the arrow is going this way. For even stay stitching, because this fabric is so delicate and it frays so easily, as you can see here, I'm gonna zigzag stitch all around the edges just to keep the fabric together sealed in. I don't have a serger, so I'm just gonna run a zigzag stitch just to finish the edges. So because I have to stay stitch going in this direction, I'm just gonna make a mark going along the 1/2 inch seam allowance. It'll just be easier for me to follow this way. Here is how that looks. I'm gonna continue on and do the same thing for the other 3. Remember, there's 4 number 2s, so same step. For pattern piece number 1, the directions for the stay stitch is different. Left side, you stitch going to the right like the arrow says, and for the right side you stitch going to the left. I marked this side with pink chalk. I don't think you can see that, and this side with white chalk, so I know to stop in the middle and switch directions. Okay, that is done. Pattern 1 has the line indicating where to add your trim. So it says you can either glue it or hand stitch it. I'm hand stitching mine. This is the trim that I am using. And here is my line. It's a faint line, but I can see it. I don't think it's showing on camera, but it goes all the way across down this way. Okay, here is one side. I wasn't sure if this was gonna work out, but it looks really cute. And I'm moving on to this side. I still haven't traced it, so I'm going to do that now. Let me just secure this. I'm just making the lines a little darker so that I can see it better. The trim is on. Isn't it cutesy? Oh, I'm so excited to see how this is going to turn out. Okay, so up next, stitch bodice front to bodice back at the shoulder seams. So here's my front and here is my back. I'm going to match these up using the notch. Okay, the seam allowance is 5/8. Okay, so the front and the back are attached at the shoulder. I'm going to put this to the side. And I'm going to pick up my lining pieces. So I'm going to turn this over to the wrong side. And I am going to apply the interfacing. So we're going to apply the front interfacing, which is pattern piece 3. This is the interfacing to the lining, and back interfacing number 4 to the bodice back lining. Here are my number 2s and my number 4s. So the interfacing for the lining is here. I'm gonna start with this one. Okay, so now that the lining has its interfacing, we're going to stitch the shoulders. I'm just gonna pin it. Using a 5/8 seam allowance. Okay, so now I am going to pin the bodice to the lining at the neckline. So I have pinned down the bodice and lining at the neck edge, and I'm gonna stitch and again at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so now I'm going to trim the seam and clip the curves. Make sure you don't cut through the seam when cutting the curves. Now step number 9 is to understitch. What I am going to do first, so this is the bodice and the lining is here, so I'm gonna press the seam towards the lining and away from the bodice. Again, this is the bodice, this is the lining, so and this is the seam, so I'm gonna press it down towards the lining. I am pressing the lining, the front of the lining, just to really define that line and make it easier to stitch it down. So now that this is pressed, so I'm going to stitch on the lining side. So the seam is now on the lining side and I'm going to stitch close to that seam. Okay, there is the seam stitched down, and here's how it looks on top. And now you just give this a good press. The neckline will not roll because we did the understitching. So now I'm just gonna press down that seam. Okay, so now that everything is pressed and in place, we're going to stitch down the raw edges. The lining is in the back, and this is the bodice. We're just putting everything together, pinning it down so that we can baste all around. So this side I have already pinned here, and I'm just going to continue all along, except obviously the neckline. The neckline is done. Okay, so I have pinned down all my raw edges now, and it's ready for basting. As you know, a basting stitch is just a long stitch. You see the basting going all around. Set the bodice aside, and we are moving on to the drapes. So we're up to number 11, we're going to narrow hem upper and lower edges of bodice front drape pattern piece 24, which I have right here. The instructions here, it tells you how to do the narrow hem. I'm going to just do the narrow hem the way I do my narrow hems normally, which is first I'm gonna stitch down at a 1/4 seam allowance. Okay, so now that I have that line, I fold over, making sure that that seam line is folded over to the back of the fabric. So the line is an indicator as to where the fold needs to be. So I'm just lightly pressing it with my finger and then pressing it with the iron. Organza will melt with the heat of the iron. That's why I use a cotton fabric to help protect it. Fold it over itself again. Another fold. So it's 2 folds, and each time that you fold, you're pressing with the iron to define those lines. I don't have actual sewing clips, so I use my hair clips instead because it's not gonna be easy to hold it down with just regular pins. This fabric is not the funnest to work with. I'm just going to stitch close to the edge. I'm gonna do it on the right side instead for a nicer finish. Okay, there is the narrow hem. I can admit it isn't the prettiest hem I've ever done, but working with organza is not easy at all. Okay, so here is my hem. Not perfect, but there it is. And now we have to gather. To gather, we have to stitch in this middle line. Because this is sheer, my markings eliminated, so I just put the fabric over the pattern. And there's the line, and I'm just gonna mark it a little bit so that I can know where to stitch. So now I'm taking one thread and pulling to form the gathering. So now, okay, so we have the 2 dots here. Adjust the gathers so that the bottom hem is touching the bottom dot, and then the top hem is touching the top dot. Pull my gathers a little closer. So I'm pinning down here. And then the other dot is there, so I'm just gonna pull a little, release some of the gathers. And there we have it. Then pin the sides. Okay, so now it's pinned. I'm gonna stitch this down permanently, like a regular permanent stitch, and then I'm going to baste along these lines. Okay, so I'm doing a regular stitch down the middle of the gathering. So that line is now, the gathers are now secure in place. Baste the sides. Oh, look how cute it looks. So at this point, the gathers are secured in place and the sides are basted. Now I will be putting this to the side because we have to do the same step for pattern piece 25. Okay, so now we're doing the narrow hem for the bodice back drapes. Okay. Actually, I think I'm just gonna fold over twice and then just stitch to save some time. And because this is so see-through, I think it looks better without having so much, so many seams under inside. Well, not so many, but the two seams. This way it'll only be one seam line. This is just about a fourth. And there's that hem. So I did the drapes hem two different ways. You could choose whichever method you think is easier and works best for you. Somehow I lost the footage after the narrow hem on step 13, but you've pretty much followed the same exact steps as you did for the drapes on the front bodice. Gather and then pin and stitch. So moving on to the sleeve now. I have pattern piece number 5 and 24 here. I'm going to put 24 to the side for now and we're going to work on pattern piece number 5, which is this part up here. The first thing we're going to do is gather. So this is pattern piece 5 and we're going to gather along this long side, the whole thing. And then on the top part, we're only going to gather from here, from this side to this side, where the little markings are. I'm just going to use this pin to show me where to begin or where to stop. Even though the machine did most of the work, I'm just going to finish gathering it. I'm going to tie one end so that it doesn't come apart. There's the first one. Okay, so I'm releasing some of the gathers just to make it easier to pin down, and then I'll distribute the gathers a little. So now I'm going to baste using a 3/8 seam allowance. Peace. Hi. Say hi. It's attached now. So the next step is to press the seam down towards the lower sleeve. So to give this a better finish, I am going to zigzag stitch this because I don't have a serger. If I did, I would just serge it. Okay, so here is my zigzag stitch. Now I'm going to press up the hem. We're pressing under 1/4. And then we stitch close to the pressed edge. I want to make it as comfortable as possible. So instead of just leaving that edge like that, fold it over and then fold it over itself again. All right, so I pinned it and now I am going to stitch it on the front side just to get a nicer finish. That's my assistant in the back. Okay, so at this point I did the hem. So this part of the sleeve, I also want to give it a better finish. So I'm going to zigzag it and then also stitch it down. This isn't something that's mentioned in the pattern. It's just something I'm improvising. Fold it over and pin it down. Now that I have it pinned down, I'm just going to stitch from the right side. Okay, and there is that line. And the inside looks like this. Even though it's not going to be touching the baby skin, I just wanted to make sure that if it does, it's not uncomfortable. So that's why I decided to do that little finish. We'll take the bodice and pin right side of the bodice with right side of the sleeve. So this is the right side. Here are my gathers. And I'm going to look for the notch that I have here and match it with this notch. Here are the notches. It's a little difficult to see on mine because I did zigzag stitch to give my edge of finishing, but I still see the marking there. So I'm going to match it with this one and I'm going to pin it there. And then I'm just going to do the same with this end. Here is my notch. It's right here. And then here is this notch. There it goes. And I'm going to match it to this one here and pin it. And then I'll pin this here. It's fine that little extra is there. I'll clip that off in a second. So I'm pinning it, pinning everything into place. Let me pin this end. And then in the middle, I'm just gonna gather a little more so that everything will fit. Okay, so I pinned down the front, the right sides of the bodice and the sleeve. And now I am going to baste. After I baste, I'm gonna stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now that the basting is done, I'm just gonna clean up the sides a little bit. And you can already see how the sleeve will look from the outside. So now I'm gonna stitch regularly using the 5/8 seam allowance. Here is that stitch. Now the next step is to stitch again 1/8 from that first stitch line. So 1/8 from that stitch line that we just did. Now that that's done, the next step is to trim the seam. Be careful not to cut through. After this, it says to press towards the sleeve, so towards this side. But before I even do that, I want to give it a nicer finish, and I'm just gonna zigzag stitch to just finish it off. Give it a nicer finish. Again, if you have a serger, you can do that too. Okay, and there we have the zigzag stitch. You see, it just brings everything together. It just gives it a much nicer finish. And now you iron the seam this way. So just iron your seam and then on to the next step. Okay, and now that that is done, with right sides together, we pin. We're going to stitch the front bodice to the back and the arm. So I'm looking at the notches, matching it up, and then pinning down. Pinning over here. Okay, so now that the front bodice and the back bodice are pinned and the arm, I'm going to start stitching down here all the way around to the arm. Again, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that this is stitched down, I'm just going to trim off some of the seam, probably like half. And I'm going to finish it off doing a zigzag stitch. Both sleeves are now done. That's how it looks. And that is how it looks on the inside. And now I'm gonna flip it because the sleeves are now done.